Why are ballistics important? Folks, this is a question that's being asked more and more often these days as we hunt with more accurate rifles, more sophisticated cartridges, more capable projectiles, and of course, the dial up scopes, the advanced rangefinders, and so forth that come as part of that package. Today, I've got a really special guest on the line with me. This is Jaden Quinlan with Hornady, engineering genius, ballistic, a nerd in the most loving, complimentary sense that word can be used. Jaden, thank you for coming on the show with me today.
You bet. You bet. It's good to see you, Joseph.
Likewise. Now, over the past decade, I have learned a tremendous amount from Jaden at various industry events, product launches, insider looks kind of behind the scenes at Hornady. I've been able to go out there and see the Hornady manufacturing facility and spend some time at the range back when you guys were just starting to work with Doppler radar, which really shook up the world of ballistics, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. You were there in the early days, and I think we've ran across each other on the side of a couple mountains randomly too.
Yes, we have. And at a few different matches along the way.
Yep.
Anyway, over time, I've come to appreciate Jaden's grasp of ballistics, both advanced and the fundamental level, which, of course, is what most of us hunters need. But not just that, his ability to communicate the concepts of ballistics is as good as any I've ever heard and better than most. So
Well, thank
let's,
you.
yeah, let's dig right in and just address that question. Anytime you've got a problem that you're trying to solve, or perhaps a concept that you're trying to teach, you have to define that
Mhm.
problem, that concept, right? So let's start with that. Why are ballistics important to hunters? And I know that's really basic, but run with it, my friend.
Why are they important to hunters? Why is ballistics important to hunters?
Yeah.
Because it allows you an understanding of ballistics allows you to predict what will happen with a fairly high level of success or accuracy. And that's important because we're walking into the unknown in hunting in many different aspects. We know the animal we're hunting, we know our system and us, but we don't necessarily know at that culmination point, that point that we're all striving for. When you lay down behind your rifle and you're ready to ethically harvest that animal, at that point you don't necessarily know what's going to happen. And if you have a strong understanding of ballistics, you can hedge your predictions and your bets pretty confidently if you understand those things. If you don't, and I think many hunters have probably experienced that, I certainly have, especially in my early days before I have the level of understanding of ballistics that I do now, of starting to press on that trigger and thinking, we'll see what happens here. Not really having enough knowledge or experience, because that can come from either place, on what I expect to happen and the level of confidence I have that that is going to happen,
Yeah,
or
it's
the
funny
inverse of that.
if I can just jump in real quick. There's a number of different phrases that hunters use that kind of address that hopeful shot. The Hail Mary, the spray
Right?
and pray, and
Yes.
so forth. Yeah, we
Yeah.
shouldn't do those, folks. Let's learn
No,
about
and
ballistics and make it ethical.
that's right. That's right. And that's a point that I've always thought we need to take more responsibility around.
Sure.
Um, I love ballistics. It's my passion. I can't get enough about it. And I know that's not the case for everybody, but I do think it is the case for every hunter, that we all bear the responsibility to have a level of knowledge that allows us to make a judgment call and to achieve that effective, ethical, rapid, taking of that animal, because we have a reputation to uphold as hunters. Um, and we know, in the, I guess, more commonly now than it was decades ago, there's there's some resistance to hunting in the culture at large. And if we don't accept and take that responsibility seriously, and we go out and we spray and pray, or we do any of those, you know, terms that you noted there, the chances of us having a bad result are very high. And when you get those bad results, that's reputational damage to the 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 process of hunting, the art of it, the people involved in it, the reputation of it. And I know I personally want that to be preserved or made easier or better, for lack of a better term, for
Yeah,
my kids and my kids' kids. You know, there's a legacy that we're handing off to future generations every time we go hunting, and an understanding of ballistics can help you do that better, in my opinion.
absolutely. I mean, all that is incredibly crucial. Plus, of course, there's the moral side of it. You know, anytime you send a Hail Mary or whatever, and which of course was more common in the past when we were really trying to get a shot made when we didn't have the tools to know we could make it.
Hmm.
Maybe you end up wounding something. You carry that burden with you,
That's right.
and it hurts. And hopefully, those who've experienced that learned from it and kind of pulled back until they learned some advanced skills and got the equipment necessary. Not that it's all about gear, but man, when it comes to ballistics, it's pretty hard to predict and use those predictions without the right compatible gear to make the most
Right.
of it. Well, let's kind of start breaking this down a little bit. Um, what elements do ballistic calculations help us compensate for? And just to run a bullet point list, obviously there's, to calculate our point of impact, so bullet drop, some wind, velocity, downrange impact velocity, energy carried downrange, although we're not really going to dig deep into terminal ballistics in this episode. And then, of course, at what distance do these ballistics begin to be important? Because your average whitetail guy in the East that never shoots past 100 yards really doesn't need to know ballistics.
Right. Yeah. For him, it's more so a go no go type choice of equipment that he's using, meaning the bullet, the cartridge, and the rifle. You know, do those three things? Do you check the box on all of those that they will work
Yeah.
at the? You know, you're not taking a uh, 17 HMR and shooting elephant at 100 yards, right? That would be the
Right.
extreme example of what I was trying to say there. So, but outside of that, you're absolutely right that this is where ballistics knowledge starts. The value of it starts to creep in, and specifically for Western hunters, it's a requirement, in my opinion, to
Yeah.
have some level of understanding. I grew up in Colorado, and so I hunted growing up there, and I've hunted a lot of the western states, the mountainous territory, and just from a terrain standpoint, there are so many different shots possible on your hunt that I think that having an understanding of ballistics is a requirement there. Where, like you said, the guy that's in Alabama sitting in a deer stand with a meadow in front of him that's 100 yards long, he doesn't necessarily need to have that understanding of ballistics because his environment isn't going to give him a shot possibility where that knowledge is required to make a judgment on whether to shoot or not.
Yeah. Right. Walk us through, and for a minute, let's get real basic. Walk us through how ballistics help us predict bullet drop, because that's
Sure.
probably the number one that hunters use.
Yep. Well, the interesting part about ballistics is it all functions based off of time. So time of flight is a term some folks may have heard. And that's a little bit difficult to wrap your head around at first because we think of everything from a range standpoint, right? We
Yeah.
look at every analysis we do is on the basis of range when we're shooting. But in reality, it's all about time when it comes to ballistics. So when you're trying to solve the problems of how much is my bullet going to drop due to gravity, that's a function of time. Uh,
Yeah.
it, there's a correlation there to distance, right? The farther the distance gets, the farther the time gets. Those two run side by side. Um, but when it comes to bullet drop, the most basic one, I would say, it's about time of flight. And the longer the time of flight is, or the longer the target is away, it's easy to see how, oh, if the bullet's exposed to gravity longer, it's going to experience more drop from your perspective, your line of sight. Um, that's really the basic start, because if we look historically, you saw, the steady progression of projectile design and cartridge design and stuff like that really uh, spent the majority of its effort in the last century addressing that problem, the bullet drop problem.
Yeah.
And an easy example of that is like the Weatherby cartridges. Those became very popular, in the last 50 years, let's say, just to throw a general bracket out there, because to your point, we lacked all of these advanced calculation methods we have today and all this stuff. And if you can make that bullet go faster, it's going to get to the target in a shorter amount of time. The less time it spends on its way to the target, the less it's going to drop due to gravity. So you've seen the pursuit of velocity really be the tool that was used to offset the unknown of bullet drop for many decades. That's pretty well gone now with the technology that we have. If you're going to be shooting um, at distances beyond, the traditional very close distances of 1 or 2, your max point blank range distances.
Yeah.
So that would be, you can aim at the animal's vitals, and how far away can it be, where you still hit within a radius or within a circle that will effectively take that animal.
Sure.
So most basically, I would say it's bullet drop has been the concentration.
Yeah. And that has evolved in the past, let's call it 20 years, tremendously. I've watched as your average hunter has gained a grasp of ballistic coefficient. And then when you guys started using Doppler, and more than just using it, teaching people about it, educating people about Doppler and how it can create a more perfect picture of the aerodynamic drag on a projectile. And hunters began, especially Western hunters that felt the need to become more proficient, more ethical shooters, man, they began to understand the characteristics of a bullet in flight better, and how the shape of a bullet, its nose, whether or not it has a boat tail, whether or not it has a polymer tip, the shape of that composite tip. And then, if you get into the nitty gritty stuff, well, is polymer the best material? Or are there some issues with polymer? Can you use a more advanced composite? And, we've become really sophisticated with this, and it's all in an effort to reduce bullet drop, reduce wind drift,
Mhm.
increase on impact velocity and on impact energy.
That's right.
And it's amazing what it's done so far for hunters. If you talk about velocity, so we've just been addressing velocity, right? And the Weatherby cartridges, back when those really became popular, because they helped shooters make up for range estimation errors before we had rangefinders and so forth.
Mhm.
Most guys were still using lead tipped bullets with a flat base. They were just driving them as fast as they could with as much horsepower as they could, right?
Mhm.
The
That's right.
smarter ones went with some of the heavier bullets, but you'd still find guys shooting a 150 grain bullet out of a 300 Weatherby for elk, because he could extend that point blank theoretical range pretty well. Walk us through why a more efficient cartridge with a more streamlined projectile is just superior.
Sure. So what you have there is, in that era, the before these modern advancements, let's say of the last 2 decades, the last 20 years, we have really seen an explosion in the capability of projectiles and their drag characteristics and all these other things. Prior to that, when velocity was the main tool used, just like you said, let's get this bullet going as fast as possible, because I don't know the exact range to the target, and the faster it's going, the flatter it's going to shoot. The issue there was most of the projectile designs of that era and prior were not very aerodynamic. They were, to your point, typically a lead tipped spire point flat base bullet. That's not the most aerodynamic design in the world. Uh, it doesn't really look like a race car. Where you look at some of these modern bullets and they look about like a race car. So as bullet design has advanced, and particularly, like I said, in the last 20 years, what we have observed is that that old adage of just make it go as fast as possible to compensate for the unknowns that we have is better accommodated for by designing a very efficient bullet and not pushing it to the extreme limits, but designing a bullet that's so efficient that you can slow the velocity down a little bit, and the efficiency of that bullet will outrun the inefficient bullet that's going significantly faster. So even though, back to the time thing, the time of flight thing, even though the time of flight of that older system that's going significantly faster, the time of flights might be shorter at 1 or 2 or 3 or maybe even 400 yards. But an interesting exercise that your listeners can do is go to a ammunition manufacturer's website. The catalog is a great resource, um, ours or anybody else's, right? And typically, you'll find somewhere where there's a trajectory table, or a table like in our catalog. At the back of it, you can find a ballistics table from muzzle out to 500 yards, every 100 yards in between, and it gives you a basic trajectory of every load of ammunition we produce. So that goes from 17 caliber stuff up to 50 BMG and everything in between. And the very interesting thing to note there, because you cover the entire velocity spectrum, you cover the entire efficiency spectrum of bullets, very high BC, very low BC, everything's in there, right? And if you go and you just go line by line, let's say you go pick 400 yards and you start walking your way down, how much drop does each one of those different cartridges have at 400 yards? They're not all that much different.
Yeah.
And probably in a surprising way. A lot of people will be like, wow, I really thought that this was supposed to be significantly flatter than this. That's
Hmm.
the story I've been told. And when you go look at those numbers, you see it's a little bit flatter for sure, maybe a couple inches, but it's not as significant as you would think. And so what we found is when you make that really efficient bullet, yes, the old archaic faster one gets to 3 or 400 yards in a shorter amount of time, but that more efficient one isn't very far behind it. And as soon as you surpass those distances, 3, 4, 500 yards, that slower, more aerodynamically designed bullet well overtakes it. It retains that velocity better. So it retains the velocity better, the energy better. It has less drop and it has less wind. All of those attributes that you noted that we're kind of in pursuit of maximizing the performance on. It's better to do that with a well designed efficient bullet than it is by just trying to make an inefficient bullet go faster.
Yes. Now, just because I can hear in the back of my mind some listeners saying, "Well, why can't we have both?" Right? That was one of the big discussions when the 7 PRC came out. It's like, "Well, my 28 nozzle are still better because it'll go faster."
Mhm.
Well, not necessarily. Talk us through some of the characteristics of an efficient cartridge that, even though it may drive, a same weight bullet a little bit slower, is in the big picture a better choice, a more optimal cartridge for the purpose.
Sure. Well, typically, and this is true not only in ballistics, but I think in every aspect of life, the harder you push things, the more sensitive things become. So
Mm,
if you take your pickup truck and you drive it around at red line all the time, you're not going to be surprised when stuff starts to go sideways, right? You start to have issues with the engine or whatever it may be. You're pushing everything to the extreme limit all the time. Things are going to break. Things are going to go wrong. It's the same thing in ballistics. When you take a cartridge and you make the case capacity significantly larger so that you can fit more propellant in there, more powder to make the bullet go faster, you're increasing the sensitivities to everything within that system because you're pushing everything harder. So, some downsides that you'll typically see: a lot of those cartridges that you can take a bullet and push it significantly harder than another cartridge. In many cases, on average, those don't shoot as good of groups as the backed off, more efficient system does. Now, again, on average, you can certainly have one of those systems that outshoots a slower, more efficient system, but on average, you don't see that. And the reasons that you don't see that is because for every shot that you put through that barrel, you're putting more fouling into the system because you're burning more propellant. You're creating higher heat. You're creating higher pressure, So the inside of that barrel is in a state of change more often as
Mm,
you use that system. In addition to that, once the bullet comes out of the muzzle, it uncorks from the muzzle. There's quite a bit of pressure still behind the bullet when that happens, and a lot of us have experienced that, right? If you lay down prone and you take a shot, and you're in a you're laying down on dirt, you can see the dirt and dust it kicks up, or you can see the blast wave hit grass. If you're shooting on grass, so there's a lot of pressure that comes out behind that bullet when it uncorks from the muzzle. The higher that pressure is, the more sensitivity you have to any asymmetry, any lack of even pressure on all sides of the bullet. If you have a little more pressure on one side than the other, you have the potential to disturb the bullet, to kind of kick it sideways a little bit. Typically, that's reflected in not shooting as good of groups. The other thing that you have happen is back to putting all of that fouling into the bore. A lot of those really hot rod cartridges that produce extremely, the highest velocities that you can get with whatever bullet you want to pick, uh, those things are typically a maintenance nightmare. If you don't
mm.
properly keep those barrels clean and remove the fouling, both copper and carbon, you can start to get pressure signs and pressure issues. You might start piercing primers, or might even leak some primers, or worst case, you blow some primers, and even worse than that, we probably shouldn't even go there, right? You can have catastrophic failures that exist. Um, and so it's a it's not an intelligent way to get the performance that you're looking for. And that's why we saw that as the employment method historically, when we didn't have this knowledge that we have now, that hey, if we slow things down a little bit and we just make the bullet more efficient, it works better. And to your point, can I take that more efficient bullet and just push it to those old school velocities that are super fast and get the best of both worlds? Typically not. You don't, nothing is for free. There's no free lunch out there. So you're probably going to have a compromise somewhere.
Yeah. You got increased recoil, you got reduced barrel life, and some other side effects there too that are fairly significant to today's rifleman and hunter that wants to be proficient and they want to practice, unlike
Mhm.
the old brag that I've had one box of ammo I've hunted with for 11 years and I still got 7 cartridges left.
Yeah,
No, these days, guys, the smart ones are trying to burn one, two, 300 rounds a summer practicing for their hunt. And
that's
if
right.
you're running a rifle that burns out in 600 rounds, that's a problem.
That is a problem. Yeah, especially if you do all that practice and then right before hunting season is when your barrel decides to retire itself on you. You can be left in a pretty bad situation.
Yep, no doubt. That's not a pretty pickle. Okay, well, very cool. Let's shift gears just a little bit and talk about. Well, I want to tie back the aerodynamic bullet and the even launched at slightly lower velocity to that time of flight.
Hmm.
So as you were noting, inside 300, even 400 yards, a lot of the bullets, cartridges that launch a bullet real fast will get to 300 or 400 yards fastest. So they have the least amount of drop. The trouble is that bullet is now slowing down exponentially faster, flat base, lead tip, or spire point type traditional bullet.
Hmm.
So it's going to take a lot longer to go from 400 to 600 yards than a really aerodynamic bullet. Here's where you start really seeing the differences in bullet drop. What about wind drift? Does that kind of correlate as well?
Yes, yes. Wind is a very interesting thing, and it's something that I misunderstood for many many years in my early pursuit of ballistics. Um, I always thought that, when you go out and you shoot in some wind, you observe that, let's say you have a right to left wind, that I start hitting to the left because of that wind. And I used to assume, and I think a lot of people still do, because I have this conversation a couple times a year, is well, the wind pushes the bullet off course. And on a simple first pass, sure, that makes sense. The wind's blowing from this way, and my bullet ends up over here to the left. It must push the bullet. But that's not how wind affects a bullet. And it's important to understand this, because if you think that, then you would think that, oh, I just need to increase the velocity and my wind deflection will be less. But that's not true. The way wind works is a function of the bullet's drag. So the wind doesn't physically push the bullet all the way off course like you observe it. What happens is a bullet is a gyroscopically stabilized object, so it's like a child's top, and that's a similar analogy you can use. So the top we all played with as a kid, you spin it on the table, um, and it kind of wobbles around a bit, and then it kind of finds a center and holds there until it runs out of spin, and then it falls over. A bullet's a fairly similar object in that it's rotating, and that's what keeps its nose point forward. When the bullet encounters a crosswind, the the bullet is always in a state of wobble. The nose is never perfectly straight. It's always kind of wobbling about the path that it's traveling on, kind of like you would see a football, maybe, that's thrown with a little bit of wobble, similar to that. And when the bullet encounters the crosswind, that wobble kind of orients itself into that oncoming crosswind just slightly. It
Hmm.
essentially finds the average between the oncoming airflow from its forward travel and that crosswind. It kind of finds the happy medium between the two. What that does is cause the bullet to fly slightly sideways. When it does that, the aerodynamic drag of the bullet is not acting directly behind it like it would if there was no wind. Now it's acting slightly, it's mostly back, but slightly to the side because the aerodynamic drag is working through the center line axis of the bullet. And so the deflection that you see on target from a crosswind is due to bullet drag. Now that's
Hmm.
important to understand, because if you think it's just velocity, then all you're going to do is push velocity as fast as possible. Well, the fastest velocities you can get are typically with the lightest weight bullets a cartridge can shoot, right?
Hmm.
However, what we see there is wind deflection is usually higher with those.
A lot
If you
higher.
take
Yeah.
Yeah. And so again, back to that more efficiently designed bullet that we've really had a lot of experience with in the last 2 decades here. Why does that bullet that's going slower have less wind deflection on target? It's because the drag of that bullet is lower. So the forces acting on that bullet to slow it down are less, meaning that when the bullet is cocked a little bit sideways and the drag is working not only back but to the side, there's less drag force. There's less force causing that bullet to deviate to the left or to the right due to the crosswind. So that's important to understand because a lot of people would think, nope, I'm going to drop down to a lighter bullet and make it go faster because if the wind just pushes it off course, the faster it gets there, the less time it has to push it. It's kind of the same concept as gravity, but that's not true.
Yeah, how cool is that? That's a very well explained. I kind of had a basic grasp of that, but you've just clarified it for me. So
Good.
awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's talk about, um, I guess I want to talk about a couple of other, crucial elements that apply to calculating ballistics and then bring it back to a practical discussion of distance. At what distance does it really become crucial to use some ballistic calculations to make your impact? So, first, atmospherics. We're talking
Hmm.
altitude, temperature, and any other related factors. Talk us through the importance of those when you go to set up the parameters to crunch your numbers to generate, to calculate that ballistic solution. How important are your atmospherics?
They're very important. So there's three, and then some of the time you're going to have to account for a fourth. So the main three would be temperature. That's a pretty easy one. A little more difficult one is pressure. This one gets a lot of people because we're used to seeing pressure as a correlation to weather patterns.
Mm.
And that gets us in trouble because those numbers are all corrected to sea level. And what I mean by that is if if you're at different altitudes above sea level, the pressures are different there. So the higher you get altitude wise within the atmosphere, the less atmospheric pressure there is. And the reason for that, a simple analogy is most folks that aren't afraid of the water have experienced being in a swimming pool. And when you go down towards the bottom of the deep end, you start to feel the pressure of all of that water sitting on top of you. And the atmosphere is the same thing. It's just instead of water, it's a gas, but they have very similar properties. And so the reason why the air pressure drops as you get higher in altitude is because you have less atmosphere sitting on top of you. There's less gas sitting on top of you, just like that swimming pool.
Mm.
And then the third one is humidity, and humidity is probably the lowest level effect. And really, frankly, for hunting applications, humidity changes have essentially no impact on your trajectories or your wind or any of that stuff. And then I said there's a fourth one, which would be altitude, and that's because of the pressure changes that occur with it. Now, of those, so we can kind of take humidity and throw it out. Let's not worry about it for hunting stuff, right? So you're left with pressure and temperature. Those two things combine to calculate what the density of the air is. So a certain pressure and a certain temperature are going to result in a certain air density. That's going to factor into how fast the bullet's slowing down. So the higher the density the air is, so this is at high pressure, so down by sea level, the pressure is higher because that whole atmosphere is sitting on top of you.
Hmm.
Um, Down at sea level, when it's really cold in the wintertime, that's the highest pressure situation that a hunter is typically going to experience. The inverse of that, the lowest pressure situations, are high up on a mountain in the summertime when it's warm. So the warmer the air temperature is and the higher the altitudes are, the lower the pressure is going to be. You could, in very incorrect layman's term, you could think of it as how thick or thin is the air that the bullet's trying to travel through. Now, there's a caveat, which is temperature, because temperature is kind of a double edged sword. Temperature plays into the density, right? How thick or thin is that air that the bullet's traveling through? But it also plays into a thing called Mach number. So,
Mm.
Mach number is the speed of sound. So, if you've ever shot with a suppressor, you've had a unique experience with Mach number because the boom of the shot going off is kind of quieted, but you can still hear like a crack sound, a snap sound, right?
Sure.
That that sound is uh, is due to a bullet being in supersonic flight. It's creating supersonic shock waves around the bullet. That's what Mach number is the speed of sound. So with most of our rifle cartridges that we're hunting with, those things are coming out of the muzzle at Mach 2 to Mach 3, somewhere in there. They're
Yeah.
moving pretty quickly, right? But the important thing about Mach number is that all of ballistics and aerodynamics are tied to it. It's kind of the grid work at which a certain aerodynamic or drag or whatever principle is going to be unique at a certain Mach number. Now, the thing that's interesting about temperature, because we're talking about environmental effects, is that Mach number is a function of temperature. And so at different temperatures, it will change your Mach number. So it's a little more of an advanced consideration. Most guys don't have to worry about Mach number at all. That's just kind of some cool additional information. But
Sure.
the main two that you're concerned with are pressure and temperature when you're hunting. And of those, keep in mind that if you get on your phone and you are trying to find what the pressure is, and you go to a weather reporting website or app or whatever it may be, that's corrected to sea level. So that's not going to represent the pressure that you're actually at. Um, there's a couple ways to get that. You can buy a handheld weather station that will measure the actual pressure of the air where you are. We have a ballistics calculator called Fordoff, and in
Hmm.
that calculator, you have to put in atmospheric information. And we built a tool in there because most of the time, say you have nothing, you don't have these fancy meter, none of that stuff, but you know you want to account for it. Well, generally with temperature, we can make a pretty good swag on what the temperature would be.
Yeah.
You know, we know if uh, and everybody has their own propensity to it, but man, when it gets below about 65, I start to feel like I need a sweater on. And man, when it gets above about 80, I'm starting to sweat. You kind of have these touch points with temperature that you can make a fairly decent judgment if you've got nothing better to put a temperature input. But pressure, how are you going to make a judgment on what the air pressure is? You can't feel the difference in air pressure at San Diego or on the top of a mountain in Colorado. You certainly can if you go running up the side of a mountain, kind of out of breath a little bit. Um,
I remember
but
when I first started trying to do ballistics, sometimes I would go to my paper topo map and look
oh
up
yeah,
the contour lines and find where it
that's
would
right.
say, 7,600 feet elevation or whatever. I'd guess the temperature, like you're talking, and then
Yeah,
I'd find the closest contour and I'd just use altitude and, of course, a standardized pressure to
right.
come close.
Right. Well, within that, what I was getting to, and that's a great point. Within the Ford-off calculator, um, if you put an altitude in, it will automatically calculate what pressure is normal at that altitude. So if you
Yeah.
don't have any equipment or you're left to bare bones, that's a tool that you can use to help you with that.
Yeah, very cool. I want to ask you more about the Ford Off app here in a little bit. How to,
Okay.
what its characteristics are and how to get the most out of it. Okay, very cool. So we got atmospherics covered, and
Hmm.
I'm sure we've got a few listeners. I mean, there are a couple of things you said. I felt my eyes starting to glaze, but that's getting into some of the more advanced stuff. Whether we're talking about how wind drift is more a function of drag than it is simply pushing the bullet sideways, and how atmospherics work and all that. You start getting Hmm, pretty technical. The good news is, folks, you don't actually have to understand the why. You just
Hmm.
have to be able to correctly assess and input the parameters, right,
Yep.
into
The stuff that
your
matters.
calculator. As long as you get your inputs right, you're going to get a good solution out.
Hmm.
Let's talk now about what distances hunters should start getting serious about ballistics, because, well, I'll just throw this out there as a starter. If I was the guy that will never take a shot past 300 yards, I don't know. I don't know if it's worth using a ballistic calculator ever. What do you think?
Right. That's a good question. I think it's always worth broadening your horizons and getting a little bit smarter. Whether you use that information or not, that's totally up to you.
Sure.
Um, but yes, out to about 300, I would say you can get away with a lack of understanding or use of any of those more advanced tools. If the wind is low, if there's not much wind blowing, I would say you could extend that out to maybe 4. But
Hmm.
once the wind starts to blow a little bit, that's where like a ballistics calculator is really a beneficial tool, because in most cases when you get to 300, you know, a 10 or 15 mile an hour crosswind is going to probably cause you to impact outside of the vital zone of the animal with
Yeah.
most stuff that we're hunting with. So I would probably say around 300 is maybe an 80% answer, right? So 80% of the time, or 80% of the different hunting circumstances, out to 300, you can know that my I've shot out to 300 and it drops about a foot, and you're
Yeah.
going to do the old, hold over about a foot. You're going to have success about 80% of the time doing that out to 300. That 20% that's left over is probably, oh, the winds are ripping pretty good this winter, and it's a 20 mile an hour crosswind. Well, if you simply just hold that foot high that you did a couple times this summer and confirmed that, that works pretty good at
Hmm.
300, that bullet isn't just going to drop straight down a foot and land where you think it is. It might drop straight down a foot and be left a foot, right? So
Yeah.
that could result in a bad shot.
And what about angles? Because as a youth, pre rangefinder, pre dial up scopes, all that, pre calculators,
Hmm.
I shot over a big deer at about, I think he was about 280 yards. Yeah, of course, it was a guess back then, but really steeply
Yeah.
downhill. I was up on the edge of a very steep mesa, and I was almost laying over the lip of this thing, aiming down at this deer. And I think I saw my bullet hit 4 to 6 inches over his back, and just, well, I mean, it shook me up that I'd missed this big deer.
Well,
And
it still
then,
haunts you to this
oh
day.
yeah, a little bit. But then, even then, I was wise enough to think it through and go like, you idiot, it didn't hold low. You knew for an angle you're going to hit high. You should have held a little bit low, but
Yep.
let's call it 280 yards. Would angle be enough to make you completely miss a deer at that distance?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. As soon as angles start to creep in, everything matters at
Yeah.
200, at 150, even at 100, depending on what your margin of error is. That's the hard thing with hunting is a lot of times we make all of our considerations or analysis off of a static broadside animal that's
Yeah.
just hanging out waiting for us to eat him, you know? And in reality, that's not true. I mean, I've had to take shots where the animal was broadside and he was standing there. He wasn't going anywhere. But between me and the animal were some trees. And I had, you know, a couple inch window to weave that bullet
Mm,
through, although
mhm.
the animal was in a premier location and position, you know, everything was perfect. But in between me, there was an error there. So yes, to answer the angle question, as soon as angles start to creep in, you can have issues if you're not accounting for
Yeah. Well, I've got a memory to help me keep track of that.
it. I think we all do. The the ones that got away, that's what keeps us hunting, right? I mean, if we were successful every single time, we'd probably hang the hat up long ago.
Yeah, it's true. Well, while we're on angle, do you mind touching on that briefly? Because I think a lot of shooters and hunters still don't entirely grasp why your bullet's going to hit high, whether you're shooting steeply uphill or steeply downhill.
Sure. Yeah. So if we look at the extreme examples, it'll help to understand the nuanced in between. So we know that when we're shooting, you know, completely flat, there's no uphill or downhill happening at all. Like we said, that guy might know that at 300 yards, his bullet drops about a foot. You know, he can compensate for that just by testing that. But what would happen if he shot straight up in the air? Would his bullet deviate by 1 foot at 300 yards from the line of sight? No. And that's a pretty easy example to understand, right? If you shoot that thing straight up, it's just going to go straight up. It's going to maintain its position relative to your line of sight. You know, the reticle that you're looking through the scope is just going to stay right there in the same position, although it's going up. So when you get in positions in between that to varying degrees, you're going to see a difference in the amount of bullet drop you have because now the bullet's trajectory has an alignment with gravity. When you're shooting completely flat, gravity is pulling at 90 degrees or perpendicular to the path of your bullet and it's trying to pull it down. Well, if you're shooting uphill or downhill at all, your bullet is aligned with the direction of gravity. Specifically shooting downhill, right? You're kind of uh, uh, shooting. I guess an easy example would be when you're um, going up or down hills driving a vehicle, right? You can. Why is it that when you come off the hill, you can let off the gas and start to accelerate? Right. That's because gravity. You're the slope of that road is in alignment with gravity and it's causing you to go faster. Kind of same thing with your bullet. It's not really going to cause your bullet to go faster, but it's just not pulling it away at the same angle that it is when you're shooting flat. So the steeper that angle becomes, the less bullet drop you're going to have.
Yeah, that makes sense. The thing is, too, here in the West, unless you're hunting antelope, you're probably going to encounter some angled shots.
Hmm.
Yeah, most of us that have hunted a lot have shot mule deer and elk across a basin where it's pretty level or whatever, but usually it's going to be on the ridge above you or in the valley, down in that canyon below you,
Hmm.
whatever. There aren't many cases where I've shot personally past about, let's call it 12 to 15 degrees. That's actually fairly steep. And a lot of shooters will take a 15-degree shot and then go say, man, it was at least, 40 degrees.
Right.
That's one of those perception things. An angle feels like more than it is, but
Yep.
probably the steepest and maybe the most important angled shot I ever took, I actually screwed up. It was 531 or 32 yards on a Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep and high in the mountains in New Mexico. I was land on the side of a mountain at 12,200 feet. The
Wow.
sheep was below me at 11,500 feet, and the angle in my binocular said 32 degrees. So,
Yeah.
pretty significant, real, documentable kind of angle. And I had everything right in my calculator, right? I I was using a kind of a ballistic drop compensating type dial on my scope, but I knew what the angle would do, and I'd taken off a couple clicks for that. Laying there prone behind my bipod, everything ready to go. When the guide, this is an area you had to have a guide, and the backup guide both said, "Man, everybody hits high, even the people that have compensated, calculated for it. So hold a little low." Well, I held in that ram's armpit, and that's exactly where I hit. Uh,
Wow.
yeah, I'd got my calculations right, and then I just let that little voice in the back of your mind, saying, "Oh, don't make that mistake everybody makes." And I headed
Right.
low, and if he'd been standing broadside, I probably would have heart shot him. But the angle was such that it entered his armpit and came out just almost in his brisket. Right.
Mhm.
Well, he marched off a little way, and I my second shot was at 591, and I trusted my solution and center punched him through both shoulders.
Cool.
But yeah, kind of a good example of how angles can be a fairly technical issue.
And for the guy that doesn't have the instrumentation, he doesn't have an angle finder, or his range finder doesn't do it, or whatever along those lines. What I've kind of observed is if it's an uphill angle, when it gets above about 15 degrees, it becomes uncomfortable to shoot.
Yeah,
Meaning the shooting position is like, this just doesn't feel right. I don't know how much confidence I have in this. It's just the rifle is at such an angle and your body's at such an angle that just not real comfortable. And then I found, if it's a downhill shot, if it's over, about 20 degrees, start to this rifle could slide away from me if I let go of it kind of feeling, so that you can kind of use that as a tool to help you judge a little bit, because you're exactly right. And I've experienced that myself and come off and said that had to be like a 30 plus degree angle, and then you measure it and it's like, oh, it was 21. Like, oh
yeah,
boy,
yeah.
I was off by quite a bit. That perception is definitely there.
Sure. Now, I've been in both those situations, shooting uphill where everything hurts your neck and it's just awkward. And then
Right.
shooting downhill, you're like, don't let go because you'll have to climb a long way to get your rifle.
That's
Yeah,
right.
those are a couple great tips, folks, to help you kind of do some field angle estimation.
Yeah.
All right. Why don't we talk a little bit about keeping it simple, keeping your ballistics simple in the backcountry, your calculations. I'm talking more for deep country hunters, that are trying to carry as little as possible and
Mhm.
make shots with as little fanfare as possible. So, you're not taking up a lot of time when you may have a very brief window of opportunity. Do you still personally like to pull out a calculator? Let's say you have a 450-yard shot at a big buck, bit of angle, bit of wind, but not too much, in the mountains or whatever. Or do you like to run an optic with an onboard ballistic calculator, or maybe a ballistic drop compensating turret on your scope? What's your preference?
Well, my personal preference is to run essentially a paper backup trajectory card,
Hmm.
and I take mine. It's pretty small, right? Because we concerned with weight and size and all that kind of stuff. It's pretty small. I laminate it. I punch a little hole punch in the top part of it, and I tie some 550 cord in there and make a loop, and I tie that around my scope bell. And the reason
Mm.
and then when I'm walking or I'm stowing the rifle or whatever, I take that card and I tuck it into the barrel channel of the stock, between the barrel and the barrel channel. Kind of keeps it clean out of the way. It's not going to snag on anything. It's not flopping around, any of that kind of stuff. But the reason I like to do that is because I can access that information from any touch point I have on the rifle.
Yeah.
So I'm a right-handed shooter. I'm laying behind it with my right hand. I can reach up with my left hand and get that card. The rifle's sitting on its bipod over here, and I'm, looking off of sitting, and I'm glassing off a tripod, and I see an animal. I can just reach over, grab it, and I can pull it because it's on that cord, and I can use it that way. If I have to take a left-handed shot, I got a giant, I'm going between two boulders or something, and I just can't take a right-handed shot. I got to go left hand. I can pull that over and use it on the other side, right? It gives me a lot of flexibility. The battery never dies on paper, which is
Yeah.
a good feature. Um, it does require that you kind of know what the environmentals are going to be ahead of time on where you're hunting. And so typically I'll look at the weather forecast, a day or two out before I go. So it's as accurate as I can get it, and kind of see what are the temperatures going to be ranging in. What does the pressure look like where I'm going? And then I'll build that card, and maybe I'll build more than one.
Mm,
Many Western fall hunts I've been on, it's bone chilling cold in the morning and it's hot enough in mid afternoon that you're shedding layers. And that's
yeah.
enough of a temperature change that at, 4, 5, or 600 yards, that's going to have a significant impact on your trajectory. So I might have two or three of them. I might have a cold morning card and an afternoon hot card, and maybe one in the middle. And I can quickly change those out because they're 550 cords sitting on my scope bell. So I just undo that one and swap them out.
Mm,
I
okay.
do
Very
I
cool.
do always use I always have an electronic calculator with me, whether that's on a
Mhm.
phone, because typically have the phone on me, or in the form of a Kestrel. I do have that as a backup. I like both of those options. But the reason that I go with the paper version, is because in so many times that I've been hunting, I don't have time to pull the phone out and
Yeah.
find the solution, or pull the Kestrel out and scroll it and find the solution. I need to make a decision really quickly. Now, when it comes to other methods, you mentioned, having a custom turret cut for your system and where you're going to be hunting. I think that's great. I've used those in the past. They work really really well within their limitations.
Mhm.
A lot of the turrets I've seen cut, they'll give you, yardages out to like 6, 7, 800 sometimes. That starts to make me a bit nervous, because when you have that turret cut, you're going to tell the manufacturer of the turret, what bullet you're shooting and what the velocity is of your load and what the conditions are where you're hunting. Well, if those conditions change a lot, that's going to start to change the values on those turrets, and to a growing degree the farther out you get. So that turret's probably just fine out to 500. Those numbers are going to be right on. But
Yeah.
when you go out beyond that, if you have a big difference from what you told that company when they made the turret to what you're actually using it in, you can see some issues.
Yeah.
Uh, Another similar one to that is a BDC reticle, a bullet drop
Mhm.
compensating reticle. Those are fairly common, and they work really well. Again, out to those same kind of distances, out to maybe 4 to 500. Those things work really well. The important thing to keep in mind with the BDC reticles is a lot of them are found in second focal plane scopes,
Mhm.
and that means that for those lines in that reticle to actually work to compensate for your bullet drop, typically you have to be on the maximum magnification of that optic. And so if you do have one of those, or you're planning on using one, just read up on that optic. Make sure you understand how to use it, because if you're like zoomed all the way in and I can't see, I'm too shaky, something along those lines, and you go backing off and you still hold line three, you're going to miss by quite a long ways.
I've
So,
seen that happen multiple times in the field. It's one of the reasons I've gone to using dial-up turrets almost exclusively.
mhm,
So, I've been a fan of a turret with yardage marks on it for a long time because I feel like it's the fastest
mhm,
system for use inside, like you say, 500 yards. I'll push it to 6 on the right rifle because you can just dial, I mean, range, dial, shoot. You don't even have to pull your card out and reference it. You just look at the number on your turret.
mhm.
Works real well if you've got a buddy that's ranging for you. Assuming you trust his ranging ability.
Yeah, absolutely.
But something I've come up with, because I'm like you, there's times when the weather changes, your temperature's way up or way down or whatnot, and there's going to be a difference. I will always have at least, on my phone, like a screen capture of my ballistics. Uh, Plus, in my favorites or whatever, I'll have the rifle I'm hunting with pulled up ready to go. And the trick I've gone to using more than anything else is on my hunt, I carry a silver metallic Sharpie marker and I just get where I'm going. Sometimes I'll do it ahead of time if I know what the conditions will be. But I'll get where I'm going, measure the average temperature, the average altitude, and I'll crunch my ballistics. And then in little silver numbers, I'll just write my yards on my turret. That way I've got the
Mhm,
MOA or mill scale plus my yards. And when I'm in
mhm,
a hurry, I just dial to those yards as long as I know it's, within my parameters and it's an ethical thing. But past 5 or 600 yards, well, I try to not shoot past 600 personally. That's
mhm.
just, you got to really, really be tuned in to do that ethically. Possible,
Yep.
but most hunters aren't there. So inside 600 yards, if there are any weird conditions, make it challenging, whether it's real steep or there's a little more wind or whatever, I will take the time to get out the calculator, measure the wind, put in all my current real time inputs, make that calculation, and then if I feel good about it, take that shot.
Hmm.
Anyway, sounds fairly similar to the system you use. I'm just writing
That's
numbers
right.
on my turret with a Sharpie marker instead of carrying the laminated hard card, but I'm gonna pick that up. I actually really like that, having
Yeah.
that backup card.
Well, I had mentioned, well, I've had to take a shot. Well, what if I need to take a shot left hand? Well, I've had
Mhm.
to do that, and I learned that the hard way. Um,
Yeah.
but another point you brought up was the phone. A good friend of mine taught me a technique where you mentioned getting a screen grab of kind of your ballistics output on your phone's trajectory calculator.
Mhm.
So I obviously use the Hornady Off program, and you can get a like a range card built in there, or there's a table view. And a buddy of mine showed me a really cool trick where you screenshot it just like you talked about, but then you set that picture to your sleep screen or whatever on your phone. I think most
Mm.
phones have a deal, where you hit the power button and it kind of comes on to like a lock screen or whatever, and you got to do your
Yeah.
password to get in. Well, you can set that background picture to your trajectory table. And so you don't have to worry about trying to get in there and then open the app and then go to all those steps are taking time. You simply just hit the power button to wake your phone up, and that table's sitting right there for you. And I've incorporated that, and it's been a really fast and easy backup.
That's an awesome trick. Yeah,
Yeah.
fantastic. Well, you've mentioned Ford off a couple more times here. Walk us through that calculator. Who should be using it and, the ABCs of getting the most out of it. And the
Sure.
reason I say who should be using it, a lot of people get confused by the number of ballistic apps available. I've recently got my son a phone because he was 14. He's going into high school playing high school football, and he needed to be able to track his exercise and his various practice routines and so forth. And I hated to do it. We don't like
Yeah.
putting phones in our kids' hands, but he's a serious hunter and shooter like me, and the thing he was most excited about was getting ballistic apps. He's like, "Okay, which one should I get?"
Yeah. That's great.
So I had him get Ford off and a very simple applied ballistics one, just the free one,
Mm-hmm.
and then the Gunworks Revic app, and
Mm-hmm.
those are the three he's been playing with. But they're all very very different. So
Mm.
we're not going to try and address all of them. You're the Ford off expert. Walk us through that one.
Well, so Fordoff, uh, we've had you'll hear of BC calculators, ballistic
Yeah.
coefficient calculators, and those have been around for a long, long time. Before they were on phones, they were on desktop computers, and before they were on desktop computers, they were on supercomputers. They've been around since, well, we're over 100 years now of using that as a calculation method, and BC works really well um, up until it doesn't. So the problems with BC, the easiest analogy that I could give you, and this is to answer why we came out with this Ford off thing.
Sure.
Um, so the easiest way to think about BC is to use a fuel mileage analogy, because we all understand fuel mileage with vehicles, right? And if you think of fuel mileage, there's kind of three different ways you can get a fuel mileage. You can go look at the sticker that's on the window of the car when you buy it, and it's got that 8 by 11 sheet of paper, and there's the little gas symbol and the highway and the city rating. Right, the manufacturer gives that to you. So that's the equivalent of BC, or ballistic coefficient. So when the car maker makes that car, they take it out and they drive a little bit in the city and they drive a little bit on the highway, and they take the fuel mileage that they measured and they say that's what it is, right? Well, a bullet manufacturer does the same thing. They make a bullet, they take that bullet and they drive the bullet a little bit, right? They shoot it and they measure the BC in kind of the same circumstances there. They don't do it across a whole bunch of different environments and possibilities and all these different things. It's kind of like the car manufacturer. Drive it on the highway a little bit, drive it in the city, calculate the mileage, publish it. That's what a BC is. Well, we all know that if we tried to calculate the exact amount of fuel, if I needed to drive from here to Utah, to come out there and go on a hunt, and I needed to have the exact amount of fuel mileage or the exact amount of fuel to get there, and I use that calculation method, I'm probably going to have some issues, right? I'm either going to be calling you stranded 3/4 of the way there, or I'm going to
Yeah.
show up with plenty left in the tank, but probably not going to nail it exactly. Well, in ballistics, you're trying to nail that fuel mileage exactly. And that fuel mileage is how long does it take the bullet to get to the target, right? We already
Yeah.
talked about the time thing. So that would be BC, and you can start to see where it would have some limitations. At closer range solutions, BC works really good. You know, out to 4, 5, 600 yards, BC works great. Even though it has its errors, not enough time has elapsed in the bullet's flight out to those distances that those errors are really shown from a point of impact standpoint that you can see on target. You know, I hit high,
Sure.
low, or left or right because of the errors. Um, where they start to creep up is beyond that. Those long road trips is where your fuel mileage miscalculations are going to bite you, right? And so there's some methods to try to make BC more usable, and that's where you adjust the BC just like you would adjust your fuel mileage. So yeah, you have the city and highway thing from the manufacturer of the car, but you're going to take your car and zero out the odometer, or a lot of them now have the fuel tracking feature or
Hmm.
whatever, you know. But you're going to go drive your car around and kind of get a good average of what that thing has. And that average is going to be more applicable than just the city or highway thing that the manufacturer gave you. You
Sure.
can do the same thing with BC. So instead of taking just the BC number that the manufacturer gave you can go out, shoot that bullet. And if you are starting to hit a little bit low, you can adjust the BC value and try to make it so that that lines up better. That's called truing
Yeah.
in more
Hmm.
advanced circles. Uh, so that's what that would be like. And that'll improve things a little bit, but you're still suffering from one number is trying to quantify all of those specific parts of bullet flight. And it's just not a good enough way. So in 2016, we had came out with the ELDX bullet by that time. And we were using those bullets a lot. You know, we're out shooting them and making sure everything's working. And I mean, you were out here shooting some of those with us in the early days. And what we saw was that at certain yardages, when we started pushing things out past 4, 5, or 600, we would start to miss by varying degrees. You might still hit the target, but I hit it pretty low. And I want to know exactly where that bullet's going to go. Well, in short, we realized that the whole process we had leading up to ELDX, the time invested in researching with the radar and designing all these products and all that stuff, that's a lot of time and money invested
Yeah.
to build a product that has that level of performance. But the level of performance we had built into that product was a moot point if you're going to miss with it. A miss is
Yeah.
a miss. It doesn't matter
Hmm.
if you have the best bullet in the world or the most bargain bin thing, you know, you found in the basement left over from, you know, uncle whoever. So a miss is a miss. And what we started to realize was that that ballistic coefficient calculation tool that's been used for 100 years was good enough for 100 years because most of our shooting for the past 100 years hasn't gone out past 4, 5, or 600 and required exact calculations, right?
Yeah.
Especially for hunting. And
Even the
so,
guys shooting service rifle at 600 or 1,000 yards or whatever, they're allowed two sighters. They
yeah,
shoot those two sighters and then they adjust because
y-
varying conditions and so forth. Yeah.
yeah. But in hunting, we need first shot capability. We don't
Yep.
get sighters in hunting, you know.
Yep.
And so we kind of went back to the drawing board. We found those issues with BC that I kind of, you know, breezed over there for a second, but in a very detailed way. I mean, we went into the math and the numbers and all of that kind of stuff. And we said, well, to fix this problem, we have to totally change the calculation method. And so that's what became the Hornady Ford off. It's the most advanced method to calculate ballistics that's available to anybody, right, with a phone or a computer, because it's on our website, it's on our phone app. Um, and you know that's a subject all to itself on how advanced it gets. But to give you a simple idea, with BC calculators, the calculator needs to know between 1 and 3 things about your bullet. Sometimes all it needs is a BC value. Sometimes it needs a BC value, a bullet weight, and a bullet diameter. But pretty basic things about your bullet. for you to run the Ford off program, you need to have 437 values that are unique to that bullet. And there's stuff you've never even heard of.
Mm-hmm.
The pitch damping coefficient at Mach 2.5. I doubt you've seen that printed on a box somewhere, right?
Is
So
that a car?
yeah, yeah. So the reason the reason that method has not been used, it's a significantly better method, produces much more accurate results. But the reason that hasn't been used for so long is because it takes so much work to generate the numbers to calculate with it.
Yeah.
Well, we figured out a way to do that for the user. So instead of them having to go try to do that themselves, which is frankly impossible for most of
Yeah.
them, you don't have the equipment to measure all that. We're doing all that for you and providing it for free. So, yeah, the Ford Off app's available for free. It's on the website. It's on Apple and Android.
Yep.
There is a BC calculator on there as well, because the Ford Off side of the calculator is super advanced, and it's really used for long range ballistics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're not going to take a 55 grain FMJ from a 5.56 and shoot to a mile with it, right? That's just a go to the range and have fun bullet.
Yeah.
So that's not going to be in Ford Off. It'll be in the BC calculator, because if you want to stretch that to 2 or 3 or 400 yards, BC is fine for that.
Sure.
But when you're talking that 175 ELDX out of the 7 PRC and you've trained with it all summer long and you are capable out to 600, that bullet's in there. And all of
Yeah.
it, it's ours, and many competitor bullets are in there. So
Yeah.
it's a big
Fantastic.
reason.
And the FORDOF stands for 4 degrees of freedom. The acronym is number 4 and then capital DOF, 4
That's right.
degrees of freedom. Yeah, folks, if you haven't got that on your smartphone, download it, start to use it. It is a bit complex, like any really capable ballistic solver is. But the more you play with it, I like to call it toilet time, right? There are
Yeah.
these moments each day where we have the ability to focus on one thing. Anyways, great tool and really advanced. And one thing, like you just mentioned, Jaden, I'm grateful that you're putting a bunch of the other manufacturers' bullets in there as well. Because when I started using Ford Off, and I still don't use it for everything, but like you say, that stuff past 4, 5, 600 yards, it just is superior. I'd always done the ballistic truing. I'd always set up a rifle, calculated my ballistic BC and created cards and all that. And then I'd go out and I'd do at least 3 or 4 range sessions just truing and inputting the corrections that I found I needed and so forth. When I transitioned to using Ford Off, initially it was with the ELD match and ELDX bullets because that's what was initially in there. I didn't have to true, and it was almost baffling. I felt like
Yeah.
I needed to do this other step, and yet I was already there. So
Right.
pretty cool, very, very capable ballistic tool.
Yeah. Saves you a lot of time and money, because
Yeah,
every time you went to the range to do all that prep work so that you would be confident in your system and your solutions before hunting season, that's all time and money.
yeah.
So yeah,
Spend
if a ballistics calculator can fix that for you, that's a pretty neat tool.
absolutely. Well, my friend, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming on the show to teach us a little bit about fundamental and edging into some of the advanced ballistic stuff today. Jaden, thanks for your expertise, your clarity of explanation, and just for your friendship here, man. It's this has been good. Is there anything else you'd like? Two things that you'd like our listeners to know about ballistics, and then where can listeners find additional information? Is there like a customer service line at Hornady or something that you can refer people to?
Sure. Yeah. Great questions. The only other things I would recommend to be a little bit more knowledgeable on, that through my experience I've seen issues with, is how good your system shoots.
Mm,
I think all too often we think our system is better than it actually is,
mm-hmm.
and so I would encourage. And but then when we go out and use it and we get a bad result, we blame it on something. Well, it might have just been that you hadn't spent enough time understanding that package that is you and your capability, your judgment call capability, and then the capabilities of the rifle itself as well. So understanding those limitations, just spend some time, go out, practice with that thing, and establish a reliable limit for yourself, a line in the sand where you can say, I'm not going to go beyond this because bad things could happen, right? I could fail, I could wound an animal, whatever that is. So I would just encourage
Absolutely.
folks to do that. And then for more information, our website's a great tool. The customer service line, you can definitely call in there if you'd like to talk to somebody on the phone. We have the Hornady podcast, so I know it's hard for me not to like dip my toe into the advanced stuff. That's kind of the world I live in. So, uh, but we have a lot of podcasts that go well into the weeds on the advanced stuff. So if any of this conversation has sparked some interest in folks to want to learn more and a little bit more about how things work, that's a good resource. Um, yeah, and other than that, I appreciate the opportunity to come on here. It's always great to see you, whether it's in person or over the screen. Um,
Yeah,
and I hope the information
likewise.
helpful. Yeah.
For sure. And folks, just to give a little plug, it was a month or two back. Hornady did an episode on their podcast on, I think it was the 5 characteristics that hunters need to know about monometal bullets.
Mm,
Fantastic. That Go back and listen to that, folks, if you haven't. In fact, one of these days, I'd love to do something like that with you guys on our show for our listeners because I learned a ton from that. Very, very informative.
great.
Jaden, thank you again. This will probably go live pretty quickly, and I'll send you guys a link. But man, I appreciate your time and you come on the show and do this with me today. Thank you.
Yes, sir. My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, we'll see you next time, folks.
All
For
right.
now, of course, just follow along on Instagram, rate, review the show, all those good things to help us grow and improve. Hit us with questions either on Instagram or you can uh, generally message me. The best way is through patreon.com/backcountry, whether it's through a paid membership or a free membership. I enjoy answering questions there, and I do prioritize that over email anymore. I can't keep up with email. I try, but I can't. So thanks for tuning in today. I'm Joseph Von Benedict here with Jaden Quinlan, mastermind and ballistic genius at Hornady. And we will see you in the backcountry.